you will have the most understanding of January 6th of anybody you know. I can assure you that, and you're going to get it from a federal criminal defense attorney who understands these types of prosecutions and has spent a career fighting the federal government. I'll be able to find the flaws and spot them for you, find the issues and the breakdowns in the justice process, and help you get through them. I have got one hell of an episode for you all today. Listen, we haven't covered January 6th because there's so much to cover. I mean, it's a behemoth thing. But as soon as we started peeling the onion back during our research on January 6th, we started to see so many problems with this entire idea. The media filled us with images of people beating cops, pushing through a tunnel, invading the Capitol building. And those images were played over and over and over again. But when you actually peel back that onion a bit more, you start to see that there are real people who were there that day and some real serious mistreatment by those people on behalf of the government. Now, certainly, there were some rioters there and there was some people who committed offenses there that a lot of them have pled guilty for. But there's a different side to this story that we're going to be able to present to you. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do it through just one episode. It's going to take several episodes. The first is going to be kind of an overview of January 6th, of what happened that day, of some of the issues with what happened that day. Subsequent episodes are going to go into the arrest and detention of some of the people involved and the legal issues surrounding that. Another episode will go into the impeachment of Donald Trump and whether or not information was properly put forward to support the theories that the government moved forward on. And I think by the end of this, we'll probably have about 3 or 4 parts, depending on how much it takes for us to get through. You will have the most understanding of January 6th of anybody you know. I can assure you that, and you're going to get it from a federal criminal defense attorney who understands these types of prosecutions and has spent a career fighting the federal government. I'll be able to find the flaws and spot them for you, and find the issues and the breakdowns in the justice process and help you get through them. I have to mention, my good buddy Sean is not with me today. Unfortunately, he had to have a medical procedure, but he's going to be back for the remainder of these episodes. So you're going to be hearing me for this episode covering all things January 6th in a pretty broad overview of what happened that day. We're going to fight like hell, is what was repeated by the prosecution at Donald Trump's impeachment hearing, attempting to impeach Donald Trump after he'd already left office for what occurred on January 6th to potentially prevent him from holding office. That was very important to the committee that was created. We'll have to note that that committee was created by Nancy Pelosi, who elected by herself to create a committee, which she called a bipartisan committee because it had 2 Republicans in it. Notably, one of them was Liz Cheney. Now, this committee was very important because ordinarily Congress, when they form committees that are truly bipartisan. Here, Republicans decided not to get involved because they knew the purpose of the committee that was led by Nancy Pelosi was to seek the impeachment of Donald Trump, something that Democrats had been calling for since 2017. In fact, I'd like to share this video with you right now, which includes a bit of a montage of Democrats specifically calling for Donald Trump's impeachment since he first went into office.
I want to say this for Donald Trump, who I may well be voting to impeach.
Donald Trump has already done a number of things which legitimately raise the question of impeachment.
I don't respect this president, and I will fight every day until he is impeached.
That is grounds to start impeachment proceedings. Those are grounds to start impeachment. Those are grounds to start impeachment proceedings. And yes, I think that's grounds to start impeachment proceedings.
I rise today, Mr. Speaker, to call for the impeachment of the President of the United States of America.
I continue to say, impeach him! Impeach 45! Impeach 45!
So we're calling upon the House to begin impeachment hearings immediately.
On the impeachment of Donald Trump, would you vote yes or no?
I would vote yes. I would vote to impeach.
Because we're going to go in there, we're going to impeach the mother
But the fact is, I introduced articles of impeachment in July of 2017.
If we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected.
My oath requires me to be for impeachment, have an impeachment hearing. He needs the scarlet eye on his chest.
The representatives should begin impeachment proceedings against this president.
It is time to bring impeachment charges against him. Bring impeachment charges.
My personal view is that he richly deserves impeachment.
I'm here at an impeachment rally, and we are ready to impeach the...
Well, we can impeach him every day of the week for anything he does.
Impeach Donald Trump. That language was shared over and over and over again. And finally, after January 6th, they had a reason to impeach Donald Trump. But in order to do that, it was important that they make it appear as if Donald Trump had, in fact, caused the riot at the Capitol that day. Now, here's some facts that we may want to get out first. And all of this information is completely verifiable if you look at the show notes. And also, we'd be happy to post a page with all of our January 6th information on it so that you can follow along, just so that you know that there's going to be no spin here. But we have to look very quickly at the timeline of when all of these events took place. And what you'll realize is that when people were actually starting to push back security at the Capitol, that was occurring before Donald Trump even stopped speaking. And when you actually look at the words of his speech, according to Donald Trump's attorney during closing argument, you'll see that the words used by the House managers in order to impeach Donald Trump were actually taken out of context, designed to make it look like the former president of the United States said, "We're going to fight like hell. We're going to go to the Capitol." But when you listen to the entire statement, and we're going to play the whole thing for you right now, just like the Charlottesville statement that we played for you previously, you're going to see that those statements weren't statements of rebellion. They weren't statements of insurrection. They were statements designed to get people to engage in the political process. And let's take a listen to that right now.
You have to get your people to fight. He told them.
You have to get your people to fight. And if they don't fight, we have to primary the hell out of the ones that don't fight. You primary them, we're gonna let you know who they are. I could already tell you, frankly.
In addition to Donald Trump saying we're going to fight like hell, we also heard popular taglines by Democrats using the word fight, using the word death, using other sorts of rhetoric that the House managers during impeachment thought was enough to incite a riot, and using those statements against Donald Trump. In fact, that sort of rhetoric had been going on for a very long time. Here's another video that Donald Trump's counsel shared during the impeachment hearing.
Every single day. One, I'm a fighter and I'm relentless, but I'm a fighter and I'm relentless. A fighter and I'm relentless. I will fight like hell.
Use every tool possible to fight for this change. We'll fight to fight, fighting hard, serious about fighting and fight.
Now that we've seen that, I'd like to go through some of the claims that the House managers used during the impeachment of Donald Trump one by one so that we can start to break these open. And we're going to touch on them in later episodes. Again, this is just going to be an overview of January 6th and some of the issues. But as you know, the impeachment hearing started with the idea that Donald Trump caused an insurrection that day, that he designed, and in fact, he was indicted for creating a scheme or plan to disrupt the election, to have Mike Pence not be able to certify the election, and to put up slates of false electors in order to prevent Joe Biden from taking office. Now, we all know that Joe Biden did take office, and we all know that Donald Trump gave over the supposed power that day. So what were the House managers really talking about? What were they trying to get after? And let's break that down claim by claim. So first, one of the big claims that we hear over and over and over again is that Donald Trump filed and lost 62 cases. 62 cases. Now, we are about the truth, not about bias, and we want to make sure that you have objective information, and we're going to give you links related to each and every one of these cases. So let's break down those 62 cases and see whether or not Donald Trump, in filing those cases and receiving dismissal, was engaging in an act of insurrection or was engaging in the judicial process as it's supposed to be done. Let's take a ride back in history to George Bush versus Al Gore. Obviously the most contested election prior to this election, and one in which there was a lawsuit ultimately making it to the Supreme Court that decided the election. Now, nobody cited Al Gore for being an insurrectionist for filing his case. Why? Because his case went to the Supreme Court, and that case was filed related to hanging chads in Florida. Those who were alive or those who were old enough to participate in the process probably remember that phrase, hanging chad. How many times was Al Gore considered to be an election denier or an insurrectionist? Absolutely zero. So, filing a case alone doesn't make you an insurrectionist. What does filing 62 cases make you? And 62 cases that were apparently dismissed. Well, that sounds a little bit worse, I would think. But let's look into this a little bit more. First, Donald Trump did not file 62 cases. That's absolutely false. The reality is that Donald Trump filed a few cases, but people on behalf of Donald Trump filed many other cases. A lot of people say that those were dismissed with hearings on the merits. Not a single one of those cases went to a trial. Not a single one of those cases went to an evidentiary hearing. And in not a single one of those cases was anybody able to get a hold of discovery to actually get information. Instead, those cases were thrown out not on their merits, but because the pleadings themselves didn't allege sufficient facts to get over the pleading standard according to a judge. And then those cases subsequently lost on appeal, except for one of them. A lowly case filed by Donald Trump that not too many people get to talk about, filed in Pennsylvania. And in that case, Donald Trump was actually victorious in his case that he filed in Pennsylvania. In fact, Pennsylvania was one of the most contested states. Many people have shown the clip of, I believe it was CNN, showing that in a span of 30 seconds, votes were actually removed from Donald Trump, which made things very suspicious. And what you'll realize if you start to look into the election a little bit more, and we can probably show a graphic related to this, but a substantial number of states right before the election was to occur changed the laws related to mail-in ballots. Of course, this was COVID-19, and there were a lot of things that needed to change as a result of COVID-19. But instead of going through the normal process that you would have seen a state go through, a lot of the executives drastically changed the rules for how you should count mail-in ballots, when you should count mail-in ballots, what mail-in ballots would be counted and what mail-in ballots would be thrown away. And of course, the numbers show very clearly that Joe Biden's voters overwhelmingly chose mail-in ballots because of their beliefs of COVID-19. And so expanding the amount of time that you would accept mail-in ballots and allowing people to mail in ballots even the day of the election caused substantial delays and caused counting to be very difficult and a very big strain on the U.S. mail system. It used to be that we had a process where people would show up to a poll to vote, and only in special circumstances you would be able to mail in a ballot. Now, it appears that anybody would be able to get and fill out a mail-in ballot without identification being checked and ensure that their vote will be counted regardless of whether or not they follow the rules. That created a very difficult system and one that was going to be ripe for litigation. And Donald Trump certainly litigated those efforts because he had a reason to, but he didn't do it 62 times. In fact, as far as I can see, there were only a few lawsuits. Trump v. Biden was one of them, Trump v. Wisconsin Election Commission, and Donald Trump v. Bakvar. There were not too many cases after that. Of the 62 cases that were filed, they were filed in 9 states and the District of Columbia between November 4th, 2020 and January 6th, 2021. We've got a graphic that you can see here related to that. Of those 9 cases, there were 61 losses and 1 win. But remember, not all of those 61 cases were filed by Donald Trump. There were 22 judges appointed by Republican presidents who oversaw those cases, certainly, and 10 Trump-appointed judges. And all three Trump-appointed judges of the Supreme Court, that some people have had issues with, rejected some of the fraud claims that came forward. But again, our question today is it illegal to file a lawsuit? Is it election denying to file a lawsuit? Is it election denying to file a lawsuit that's ultimately unsuccessful, a la Al Gore? And how many cases did Donald Trump actually file on his own? And what were the claims made in those cases? So let's get to them specifically. First, we have Trump v. Biden. Trump v. Biden, in a 4-3 decision, not every judge disagreed with Trump's position here. The Wisconsin Supreme Court dismissed 3 of Trump's 4 claims under the doctrine of laches. What does laches mean? It means that you didn't bring a claim timely enough. Is that a denial of Donald Trump based on the merits of his allegation? No. That's a denial because the claim wasn't brought in time. Now, how do you bring a claim with sufficient evidence related to an election where you don't have time to investigate that and nobody will give you the information? It was decided on the merits of the Trump claim that voters wrongfully declared themselves indefinitely confined. I guess what Donald Trump challenged was the definition of what would be considered indefinitely confined, allowing them to be able to receive a mail-in ballot. That definition was expanded. Now, ultimately, the court ruled against Donald Trump on this claim because Trump challenged the status of all voters who claimed an indefinitely confined status rather than individual voters. What the court in Trump v. Biden wanted Donald Trump to do in order to be successful in this 4-3 decision was to find specific voters and list them in the lawsuit and say why those specific voters weren't indefinitely confined, necessitating a mail-in ballot. That's absolutely bonkers. The idea that you would be able to go through Wisconsin and look for specific indefinitely confined voters. No, the reality was that he was challenging a change in definition of that and arguing that they didn't uphold their duty in Wisconsin to ensure that only people authorized received mail-in ballots. That is something that is certainly legitimate. Trump petitioned to the U.S. Supreme Court for writ of certiorari on December 29th. A motion for expedited consideration was filed, but the court denied his motion to expedite. And of course, based on only the denial of the motion for expedition, Donald Trump didn't make the claim before January 6th. And so the case was ultimately dead when Joe Biden took office. There was no decision on the merits in Trump v. Biden, only a denial of his motion for expedited consideration. That's very important to know. Again, we've got people reporting that all the Supreme Court justices are against Donald Trump, but there's one perfect example of a case that was decided in a 4-3 vote by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Not a lot of Trump supporters on that with Wisconsin Supreme Court, that ultimately determined that his claim was out of time and needed to be more specific. The next case we should cover is Trump v. Wisconsin Election Commission. In this case, the district court dismissed Trump's claim that Wisconsin officials violated his rights under the Electors Clause because said officials allegedly issued guidance on state election statutes that deviated significantly from the requirements of Wisconsin's election statutes, guidance that deviated significantly from the requirements. First, the court found that interpretations of the election administration rules do not fall under the meaning of manner in the Electors Clause. That sounds quite complicated. Moreover, even if manner were read so broadly, the defendants had acted consistently with and expressly authorized by the statute. The Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit affirmed the district court's opinion. Trump filed a petition for writ and a motion for expedited consideration, and expedited consideration was denied by the Supreme Court. Here we have another case. It was not some ridiculous claim of voter fraud. It was not some claim that people were stuffing ballot boxes. It was a claim that they changed the meaning of some of these statutes without going through the election process. And that claim was ultimately decided not on the merits, but because it takes a lot to get a case through the courts between December 24th, 2020 and January 6th, 2021. Let's go to Donald J. Trump v. Bakvar. District court in that case determined that Donald Trump lacks standing to file this case, not decided on the merits, but lacks standing. Standing is a concept that you all should know about. In order to get access to the courts, you have to have standing, meaning you have to be the one that's injured in the case. And if you're not one of the ones that's injured in the case, or you don't have some injury from the case, then you may not have standing to bring your case forward, which means you shouldn't get access to the courts. Donald Trump filed an equal protection claim. And because Donald Trump is the person seeking election and not a voter, they said that he can't actually challenge this voter case. The district court held that different counties implementing different types of notice and cure policies did not violate the Equal Protection Clause. Notice and cure relates to notice that your ballot is insufficient and the ability to cure it. The district court highlighted the fact that the notice and cure policies adopted by certain counties impose no burden on voters, and it would be impossible to require every single county to administer elections in the exact same way. Go figure. Too difficult to administer elections in the exact same way. Donald Trump's case was denied, and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit affirmed his decision. Those are just 3 cases in which Trump's name actually appears on the V, which means he filed the case. A lot of the other cases weren't filed by Trump. They might have been filed by other organizations that support Trump, but yet in the media you hear over and over and over and over and over again that Donald Trump himself filed 62 cases, and those cases all resulted in some sort of denial or dismissal. Well, you've got the ground truth here and the specific number of cases, and not a single one of them was dealt with at a trial with discovery. And that's something that due process ultimately requires. Let's go to the next issue. The next claim by the House managers is that Donald Trump incited violence on January 6th by making statements designed to incite violence. Fight like hell, something I talked about earlier. That was a tagline that was used constantly during the impeachment of Donald Trump. He said, "You've got to get your people to fight." And I think we can play that clip soon, but as you listen very closely, Donald Trump clearly says, we have to get your people to fight, and if they don't fight, we're going to have to primary the hell out of them. Take a guess. Who are we talking about there? Now, would you think it's appropriate for a House manager, somebody running a very expensive multi-million-dollar impeachment against Donald Trump, to take that phrase, "We have to get your people to fight," and clip it right there, and use that clip as a basis for impeachment of a president for inciting violence, when they remove the next portion of the phrase, "If they don't fight, we're going to have to primary the hell out of them"? Listen, Donald Trump says some words. He says some things that aren't popular and aren't favorable. But it's very clear. The Brandenburg case tells us exactly where the line is drawn between speech, free speech, and illegal speech. Illegal speech is speech that is designed to be involved in the commission of a crime. That might be speech that engages you in a conspiracy, or speech that might immediately and incite violence. A couple facts are very clear when we look at this case under the Brandenburg standard, which is the current standard under the law in the United States and the standard that every legal scholar respects. The speech must immediately have the potential to incite violence. Did this? No. The speech must be designed to incite violence. Was this? No. Another way to look at this is asking to primary the hell out of people. Is that something that would lead people to be violent? Well, I'm not aware that primaries are violent processes. I'm aware that primaries are part of the political process.
We saw this same type of speech used by Democrats with absolutely no charges filed, with no impeachment, and no indication whatsoever from anybody that that sort of speech was prohibited. Again, we've talked about it a lot, but there appear to be 2 systems of justice here. One that applies to those people who are popular, and one that applies to those who are unpopular. Now, let's go to the context surrounding the speech. As we all know, Donald Trump was there speaking to a crowd of people who'd all gathered to Washington to hear Trump speak, to march, to protest. Some may have had violent things on their minds. Some may have had the idea that they were going to do something at the Capitol. And some certainly may have thought that they were persuaded by Donald Trump to do something. But under the Brandenburg Standard, the question for us is, does that make it illegal conduct by Donald Trump? And the answer is a resounding no. Under Brandenburg, clearly, the speech would have to immediately incite violence. Could you imagine if you, your son, your daughter made a statement, might have been hurtful to somebody else, and that statement may have caused that person to harm themselves or maybe harm somebody else? Would you want criminal consequences coming to them as a result of the speech, unless that speech was designed specifically to cause harm, unless that speech was criminal? I think a lot of us would rather speech be protected, because speech and action are two different things, and even speech that causes action must be scrutinized in order to make sure that our First Amendment rights aren't abridged. Now let's talk about the type of speech that starts a riot. Well, you may all recall that before January 6th, there was a significant riot that occurred. Riots that had swept Minneapolis, the riots that were related to the Rittenhouse case, riots where there were buildings burned, even in Tim Wall's area. In fact, I think we can get some footage of those riots here.
This is an apartment complex on fire, and it just collapsed. The building just collapsed.
I have nowhere to go now. These people did this for no reason.
This is just a snapshot of some of the damage that people will be waking up to.
Going up, but police clearly...
I'm proud of New York, and I'm proud of the protests.
There is damage everywhere you look. Honestly, it looks like a war zone.
In those riots, the question for us is, were they caused by anybody? Were they caused by speech? Were they caused by people that might have rallied other people together? And were there charges filed against those people that caused those Black Lives Matter protests and the riots? Well, we know that 1,000 buildings were burned in one town, Tim Wall's home state. 6 charges were filed against folks involved in that. And we can take a look at this clip right here with a tremendous amount of rhetoric from Kamala Harris herself, from Chuck Schumer, as well as Nancy Pelosi. Could arguably be considered the same type of speech, if not way, way worse than Donald Trump's speech with zero consequences.
They're not going to stop. And everyone beware, because they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop before Election Day in November, and they're not going to stop after.
And please, show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country. Maybe there will be.
It was a violent night in St. Louis. They shot and killed David in cold blood.
Destroying property which can be replaced is not violent.
Now, some could say that even though Donald Trump's speech may potentially have caused a riot, but may not actually have caused a riot, the question would be, should Donald Trump have done something to stop the protests and the riots that day? Well, there seems to have been an insinuation that not only did Donald Trump fail to say anything in response to these protests, but that he actually incited them himself. And let's take a look at some of the more detailed facts and circumstances surrounding that day. First, I think I'd like to point you all to a video that recently surfaced of Nancy Pelosi masked up, taking responsibility in a car, not knowing she was being recorded for all of the events surrounding January 6th. Let's play that clip now.
We have responsibility, Terry. We did not have any accountability for what was going on there, and we should have. This is ridiculous. You're going to ask me in the middle of the thing when they've already breached the inaugural stuff that should we call the Capitol Police? I mean, the National Guard? Why weren't the National Guard there to begin with?
They thought that they had sufficient resources.
That is not a question of how they had. They don't know. They clearly didn't know, and I take responsibility for not having them just prepare for more.
And I think it's also important to explore what Nancy Pelosi is really talking about in this clip, the National Guard, and whether or not the National Guard was deployed. This information also came out just recently. On January 3rd, the Assistant Secretary of Defense and chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff met with the president and concurred in the activation of the National Guard, the president at this time obviously being Donald Trump, and they all concurred that National Guard should be used to support law enforcement that day, particularly because there was a plan for a lot of protests. Many people saw differences between the number of people that were there to protest on January 6th versus the Black Lives Matter protest that happened in Washington, D.C. But one thing people didn't point to is the difference in law enforcement support between the two. We saw much more law enforcement for the previous Black Lives Matter protest and much less law enforcement for the January 6th protests. January 3rd, Donald Trump calls for the activation of the National Guard to come to Washington to help out. He requested 10,000. The District of Columbia mayor decided that not that many were needed. In fact, we've got a specific document posted by Chairman Loudermilk, published, never seen before, that showed Donald Trump and his staff requesting 10,000 National Guard, and yet he's charged with not doing enough to stop the riot. Who put the kibosh on the 10,000 National Guard? Well, it wasn't Donald Trump. It was the D.C. mayor. It was Nancy Pelosi. It was the sergeant at arms for the Capitol, those in charge of making sure there was enough staff. So we're short 10,000 National Guard, or 5,000, or 2,000. 3,000 protesters, an estimated 3,000 were around the Capitol in an area that could have arguably caused some potential harm. How many National Guard would it have taken to thwart those people and to prevent them from breaking through a line? Probably not 10,000. If there was half that, we wouldn't be talking about this right now. Well, in addition to that, we also have Capitol Police, DC Police. We also have actual service members assigned to protect the Capitol building. 1,900 of them, with riot gear, with batons, with the types of weapons that we saw. 1,900 of them. Were they all on duty that day? Were half of them on duty that day? The answer is no. The police force was incredibly unprepared. Let's talk about the boundaries and the guards that were set up. We can see some of this in the video, but bicycle racks were used to guard areas around the Capitol. The fences that were put up were in some cases plastic and not even real. Signs that were put up were there not to stop people from occupying the Capitol grounds, which is traditionally supposed to be an open place. But the signs were up because of projects that had happened earlier. In fact, there were no signs up indicating that people at the Capitol building could not progress past certain areas. And when those barriers went down and when those signs went down because people broke through them, people who had no idea what had happened at the front of the line continued to march forward and had no idea they were breaking through this invisible barrier that had been created before. In fact, there really are three types of people who were there at the Capitol that day. There were people that were there to do violence, and some people acted in very violent ways. There were also people who went there to protest and got a little carried away. But then there was another group of people who never saw fighting. They never saw violence. They never saw barriers. They never saw people breaking through windows in the Capitol building. They saw crowds of people streaming forward into the Capitol. They saw Capitol Police not preventing their forward access into the Capitol. And they proceeded along. In fact, I've talked to a number of these people. Some of them went inside the Capitol and some didn't. And some of them weren't aware at all that that was forbidden. Well, it goes even further. There was a congressional hearing conducted to discuss whether or not there were requests for police.
DC police say they have asked the DC National Guard to come and help them out.
Now the National Guard has been activated to try and keep the peace here in this city.
I've been told by the mayor's office that the number of DC National Guardsmen being called up is around 340. At any given time, it's going to be about 100 troops out in the streets.
340 National Guard, that was all that was called for. But you could see what was happening here. They were using the claim that the National Guard was called as a way to sort of malign Trump, to suggest that his rhetoric had been so serious that they had to call in the National Guard. But when it came time to really call in the National Guard, they took credit for it. Instead of what we later learned was actually Donald Trump meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff asking for the National Guard, we saw that Bowser took credit for calling the National Guard. But when it came time to decide what that number would be, how many did they call for? 340. 340 National Guard, 340 people spread so thin, and were they deployed immediately around the Capitol? No, that's not the case. According to the story, there'd be 100. And the rest, where would they be? Well, they weren't there. They weren't there in the Capitol that day, and the D.C. police weren't there in the Capitol. Why would a protest like this be so unguarded? Now let's get to Chairman Loudermilk's document that we later received. According to U.S. Capitol Police, there's no request for DOD support. The Assistant Secretary of Defense met with the cabinet members to discuss DOD support to law enforcement agencies and potential requirements for DOD support. The Assistant Secretary of Defense and Joint Chiefs of Staff met with the President. The President concurs in the activation of the D.C. National Guard to support law enforcement. Monday, January 4th. They confirmed that there is no requirement for DOD support in a phone call with the Secretary of the Army, the Assistant Secretary of Defense in consultation with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of the Army, the DOD General Counsel, reviewed the department's plans to be prepared to provide support to civil authorities if asked, and approve activity of 340 members of the D.C. National Guard to support Mayor Bowser's request, a request that she later took credit for. Support provided in response to Mayor Bowser's request includes support at traffic control points, 90 personnel. Metro station support, 24 personnel for the entire metro station. Weapons of mass destruction civil support teams, 20 personnel. And international command and control, 52 personnel. How many would that leave on the ground outside the Capitol building? Not nearly enough. The Assistant Secretary of Defense also authorized the Secretary of the Army to deploy a quick reaction force of 40 personnel staged at Joint Base Andrews. I think that without traffic, I think we're talking about at least 40 minutes to get there. Now, let's get to that hearing that I alluded to. And later we learned that Nancy Pelosi lied about not talking to the Capitol Police Chief before January 6th. Let's watch.
And I briefed all of the leadership of the plans to get them back into chambers. That would have been call number 3 with Speaker Pelosi.
So you didn't have one call, you didn't have 2 calls, you had 3 calls. So Speaker Pelosi's comments that she didn't speak to you are inaccurate.
That is correct, sir.
Today we're here to discuss the security failures that occurred on January 6, 2021, and how we can prevent these failures from occurring again. I want to dive into the questions, Chief Son. In your transcribed interview, you mentioned that you met with the House Sergeant at Arms regarding the National Guard prior to January 6th. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And who was the House Sergeant at Arms leading up to and on January 6th?
That would be Paul Irving.
And the House Sergeant at Arms is appointed by who?
It was appointed at that time by Speaker Pelosi.
And in your transcribed interview, you mentioned that when you first brought up the National Guard to the House Sergeant at Arms in the days leading up to January 6th, that Mr. Irving said he, quote, didn't like the optics, end quote.
Didn't like the optics. The optics of calling in the National Guard. The National Guard that Donald Trump wanted called in.
That is correct. He referenced being concerned for optics.
And on January 6th, when you went to Mr. Irving to get his approval to call in the Guard, Mr. Irving said he would, quote, run it up the chain. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That was a telephone call. I didn't see him in person when I first made that request.
The House Sergeant at Arms is considered probably the most senior security official on the House side. When Mr. Irving says he has to, quote, run it up the chain, end quote, what did that mean?
I took that to mean his leadership chain.
And who would be his leadership chain? If he's functionally the most senior security official on the House side, correct?
That's his title. That's part of the title, the senior law enforcement official for the House of Representatives. But he would have been referring to the leadership team that goes up to Speaker Pelosi.
So the political leadership team, meaning elected officials, not another security official, is that your understanding?
That is correct, sir. He's the top security official for the House.
So running up the chain would most likely, in your opinion, is through the Speaker's office and possibly to Speaker Pelosi?
That would be where it ends, yes.
Directly up to the Speaker's office. As we can clearly hear, the request for National Guard needed to be run up to Pelosi's office. We're going to find out where that 340 number came from.
Okay, so let's park that there, and then let's jump to a second set here. In a press conference on January 7th, Speaker Pelosi called for your resignation on national television. Speaker Pelosi also stated that she had not talked to you since the initial breach of the Capitol. But according to your transcribed interview, you were on the phone with Speaker Pelosi a few times. Can you explain that discrepancy?
Yeah, that is correct. I spoke to Speaker Pelosi 3 times that evening, and she went on national TV and said I'd never spoken to her, but I spoke to her 3 times. The three times were the first time when I went over to brief Vice President Pence at the secure location. I'd called House Sergeant Arms Irving, told him I was going over to brief the Vice President. I was also going over to do a personal assessment of the Capitol. At that point, things were getting under control. Went over there, briefed him on when we can get them back into chambers with Mr. Irving being fully aware. He said he wanted to get Speaker Pelosi on the phone. He made a phone call from his cell phone at approximately 5:34, where I first briefed Speaker Pelosi. The second call was when I left that location. As I was walking away, I met up with Mr. Stenger, and we started walking over to the Senate to go brief the Senate. When Jennifer Hemingway, I believe it was Jennifer Hemingway, handed me the cell phone, and it was Emily Barrett's cell phone calling her, and it was Speaker Pelosi on the other line. This is my second call with Speaker Pelosi, questioning the information I'd given to Vice President Pence about when we can get back into chambers. I assured her that information was correct. I could get them back into chambers by 7 p.m., and the call ended. That was call number 2. Call number 3 was 6:25 p.m. I was over at the Senate from the secure location, from where the Senate had been sequestered, and on a cell phone using Robert Karam's cell phone, they dialed leadership, who was over off-site at a secure location, and I briefed all of the leadership of the plans to get them back into chambers. That would have been call number 3 with Speaker Pelosi.
So you didn't have 1 call, you didn't have 2 calls, you had 3 calls. So Speaker Pelosi's comments that she didn't speak to you are inaccurate.
That is correct, sir.
Speaker Pelosi's claims calling for the resignation of somebody who served their country, probably more diligent than she did, are inaccurate. It's abundantly clear based on testimony under oath by people who were involved in responding to the Capitol that day that Nancy Pelosi, the person who put together the committee designed to figure out what happened at the Capitol, lied about what happened at the Capitol because, as we later found on a surreptitious video taken, she was the one responsible. Now, some people may call this bias, and some people may think that things that tend to support Donald Trump may ultimately be biased or incorrect. But the facts are the facts. We have Nancy Pelosi, responsible for the security of the Capitol, aware of a request for National Guard. We have Donald Trump requesting up to 10,000 National Guard. That came from Chairman Loudermilk's memorandum that included the specific communications in the time. And then we see the D.C. Capitol Police Chief specifically stating that too many National Guard would be bad for optics, so they settled on a 340 National Guard member. We know Nancy Pelosi was in the front of a car while she's being videotaped in the back after January 6th, saying that it was our responsibility. We know that she created a committee after that. And her job for that committee was to take the blame off of Donald Trump. To take the blame off of herself and put it squarely onto Donald Trump. 2 birds with 1 stone. First, it prevents her from being ridiculed endlessly for allowing the Capitol to be attacked because of her rhetoric. Second, it puts the blame on Donald Trump. And if this results in a prosecution and impeachment, even better. So what do they try to do? They impeach him so he can't run for office again because of how scared they are. And then when that's not successful, they decide to file criminal charges. Why do they decide to file criminal charges? To double down on the theory that Donald Trump started this and that Nancy Pelosi should not be held responsible whatsoever. It's important that we play the full video of the rhetoric that we see against Donald Trump prior to January 6th, and to see who really was inciting people.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country, and maybe there will be.
There needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
You got to be ready to throw a punch. You have to be ready to throw a punch.
Donald Trump, I think you need to go back and punch him in the face.
That I thought he should have punched him in the face.
I feel like punching him.
I'd like to take him behind the gym if I were in high school.
One, I'm a fighter and I'm relentless. But I'm a fighter and I'm relentless. A fighter and I'm relentless. I will fight like hell.
But the way I see it now is that we pick ourselves up and we fight back. That's what I think it's all about.
To continue fighting, we each have an important role to play in fighting. In this fight, like so many before it, it has been a fight. The American people are going to have to fight. And about the importance of fighting, I will always fight. Fighting. But we always must fight. Joe Biden has a deep, deep-seated commitment to fight and to fight. And about the importance of fighting. We always must fight, to fight and to fight. As our willingness to fight continued the fight, as Joe Biden says, to fight. It's about fighting of what we're fighting for. We will tell them about what we did to fight. Really about a fight. But truly, I do believe that we're in a fight. I believe that we are in a fight. I believe we are in a fight. I believe we are in a fight. So there's a fight in front of us. A fight for all of these things. And so we're prepared to fight for that. We know how to fight. Our ongoing fight of fight. We know how to fight. We like a good fight. We were born out of a fight. This is what is our fight right now.
Officer Harry Dunn was hailed as a hero. Harry Dunn decided to write a book. Harry Dunn wrote a long book and testified multiple times about what he went through and the heroic actions that he undertook at the Capitol. Now, those statements went unchallenged until some video became available, largely because of Republicans, despite the fact that it was hid for a very long time. In fact, there are still cameras where no footage has been released because the Capitol and the Sergeant-at-Arms are claiming that those videos are necessary to protect national security, despite the fact that those videos are not of the inside of the Capitol, but rather the Capitol grounds on that day. Nonetheless, Harry Dunn decided that because that video wasn't released and other video in the Capitol, that he had impunity to say he engaged in heroic actions that day. Harry Dunn testified at the Oath Keepers trial, the trial of the groups that came to Washington, D.C., and it was a very long trial related to some of the folks who started some of the violence there that day, allegedly. He provided 2 statements to the FBI as well, and he made some claims. First, he says he arrived at the Capitol at 6:45 a.m., a nice early start for Harry Dunn. He said he picked up his Riot helmet and was positioned at the east side of the Capitol at 9:30. Well, when we actually look at the tape, we can see Harry Dunn arriving at 10:53 a.m., and it appears that he's just arrived. He has no gear. He has no Riot helmet. He's just starting his day. In fact, 11 o'clock, we see him scrolling through his phone, heading to the lower level on his way to take some gear. And he took his post around 12:19, 2.5 hours after he claimed he took his post. Even the beginning of Harry Dunn's statement was a lie. I talked to a witness that was in the courtroom when Harry Dunn was testifying, and they knew it was a lie, even while he was saying it. And yet Harry Dunn has been charged as being one of the most heroic people in January 6th. Harry Dunn claims that at 12:53, this would be a half hour after he actually took his post, that people had breached the line. He said he put on a steel chest plate and did not respond to orders calling for immediate enforcement. He claimed that he sprinted around the Capitol when he first heard the radio go off. What actually happened? Harry was taken inside because they wanted all the M4s inside. So a lot of staff collapsed on the Capitol building in order to return their weapons so those weapons weren't taken from them and loose. The people in charge of defending the Capitol were asked to return and hand in their weapons. Harry Dunn then claims he went to the basement to help an officer with a defibrillator. Well, that didn't happen either. Once he retreated inside the Capitol, He was inside for about 40 minutes. And he acted like a doorman for protesters coming in. There's a tremendous amount of footage of Harry Dunn just letting people in the Capitol without doing anything about it. And then we see Harry Dunn in one of the lobbies getting very aggressive with people. In fact, he got so aggressive in one moment, one of his supervisors told him to calm down and patted him on the shoulder. I believe that was Captain Ben Smith. Eventually, he decides to run to another side of the building and he drops his magazine, which bounces off the floor as he made an encounter with the Oath Keepers. Now, despite the absolute folly of Dunn's statement, and despite the fact that his statement contains many inaccuracies that, as we can see on the video, won't totally pan out in Dunn's favor, despite the fact that people seem to think that Dunn wasn't testifying truthfully, he was hailed as a hero. He unsuccessfully ran for office. He's photographed next to Joe Biden, and he is the saint of the Capitol building that day. Can we find a single heroic thing that Dunn did? No. Do we see him helping out his brothers and sisters at the Capitol to try to protect it? No. But we do see him trying to take credit for a truth that he created, which really was a fiction of his own. We can see that a narrative was set up regarding January 6th, and it was designed to lump people together. I talked about 3 types of people earlier. The first type, those that were fighting. The second type, those that got caught up in it, the groupthink. And then the third, people who had no idea that there was fighting or combat. And I've spoken to people that were involved in all 3 of those groups. But there's one that I spoke to in particular, Ryan Zink. It has a compelling case, a tragic story. Ryan went to the Capitol that day with his father, who's currently running for Congress. The election will happen in November. He's running in Maricopa County, I believe. And Ryan talked to me at length, actually last night, for probably about 2 hours. And I hope to have him on as a witness to talk about what he experienced. But unfortunately, he's got to report to jail pretty soon, so hopefully we can catch them for a later episode, which we will mark as its own part, because I think you need to hear his story, but just so that you understand some of the people that are involved in this. Now, there's one other thing that we have to talk about, and that is who was really behind whipping up the crowd on January 6th. Some might say the Proud Boys were there, and they were loud and vocal. Some might say the crowd engaged in groupthink. And some might actually say that there were federal agents who were inside of the crowd and involved in the crowd, whipping them up and trying to make statements to get people to go into the Capitol and storm the Capitol. Ted Cruz wanted to address this and specifically asked if any FBI agents were involved. And here's some video of an agent who was not able to respond to that question.
Nobody in authority seems interested in the slightest in finding out who he is.
Any FBI agents or confidential informants actively participate in the events of January 6th, yes or no?
Sir, I can't answer that.
Did any FBI agents or confidential informants commit crimes of violence on January 6th?
I can't answer that, sir.
Did any FBI agents or FBI informants actively encourage and incite crimes of violence on January 6th?
Sir, I can't answer that.
We also have some curious events that were going on inside of the crowd on January 6th and before January 6th. In fact, there's one indication of a gentleman who decided to say, let's go in the Capitol, let's go in the Capitol. People around him start chanting, Fed, 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 because of how outrageous this person's behavior was.
There's a man called Ray Epps, who was a longtime conservative activist. He was captured on camera at least 3 times, possibly more, encouraging people on January 6th and the day before, January 6th Eve, January 5th, encouraging protesters to storm the Capitol.
Tomorrow, we need to go into the Capitol. Into the Capitol. Peacefully. Fed.
25% of people in the United States think that January 6th was orchestrated by the FBI. Now, a lot of those people may be confused and maybe they're working off of misinformation, but then you would expect the FBI to be able to come out with a statement and say, we had no agents involved in January 6th. The reality was we know that there were agents who were embedded in the crowd. We know that there were agents who were involved in monitoring the Proud Boys, maybe even involved in them. And we knew that in the jails, the detention centers after January 6th, we could very clearly tell that there were people who were looking to provide information to the federal government that were involved in that crowd. Many of them may have been agents and, in some cases, confidential informants. Why has our federal government not come forward and said, we had agents? Why have they not produced evidence of these agents in discovery in cases? And why have we not learned of the statements of every agent that might have been involved in inducing hate? Here's the reality. If inducing somebody to commit an act of violence, like saying, let's storm the Capitol, is a criminal offense when Donald Trump says it, then why would making a statement to induce people specifically to go towards the Capitol not be considered a criminal offense when an agent makes it? And further, why is it appropriate for an agent to try to incite people to engage in conduct that they ordinarily wouldn't by making those sorts of statements? I think a full investigation needs to be done as to whether or not there were any agents inside the crowd and what statement those agents made, because people are coming forward with some videos that are incredibly suspicious and make it look like there may have very well been agents involved in January 6th. I'm going to suspend my belief on that until more information comes out, because I'm a lawyer, I like facts, and we deal with facts, and that's what I like to deal with on this show. But 25% of the American population seems to believe something like this, and there's a significant amount of videos supporting that. We don't have statements by people like Nancy Pelosi or the director of the FBI saying otherwise, leaving people to continue to search for information and find a way to verify or disprove whether federal agents were involved in January 6th. We've got a lot more to talk about with respect to January 6th. We've got a lot more to investigate. Ryan Zink will be on with me for, I believe, the next episode. We are going to take a significant deep dive into the detention, the prosecution. We're going to go inside of a January 6th trial so that you can know what it was like. And Ryan's is one of the most interesting trials of all of them that I've seen. Someone who had a significant number of charges dismissed against him. His father will talk to us. He's going to talk to us before he reports to jail. And you're going to see what it's like to be a defendant in January 6th, where you didn't go into the Capitol. You didn't hit a cop. You went to trial, and now you have to report to prison. You're going to be able to hear from Ryan and see what that feels like. You're going to hear about the conditions of that D.C. jail. In addition to that, we're going to go a little deeper into the impeachment hearings and some of the evidence that was actually falsified and brought forward during Donald Trump's impeachment. Has anybody faced any sanctions? Any attorneys been disbarred for that? You'll find out that that's not the case, but you'll be able to see the fraudulent evidence yourself. And in the end, by the time that this complete investigation is done of January 6th, I think you're going to see that there were three types of people at January 6th. And unfortunately, Nancy Pelosi wanted there to only be one type of person in January 6th. But the truth will come out, and we'll be able to get to the bottom of it in as many parts as it takes. If you aren't already a subscriber, hit that subscribe button. Follow us for future episodes. Take a look at some of the prior episodes talking about Boeing, about free speech, about the Hamas campus protests that were funded by terrorist organizations in the United States with no criminal punishments whatsoever. Take a look at the detail that we bring to some of these issues so that you can decide for yourself what really happened. If you have any comments about what I've said today, if you have any dispute, if you have any evidence otherwise, these are confusing topics sometimes, and I'd love to hear it. Even if you have maybe a claim that counters mine, I would certainly love to hear it. Let's keep the dialogue going. This is how we keep truth in America, by talking about it. Thank you all for joining me. Ron Chapman on The Wall.